AITA for refusing to let my sister stay with me after she got married and demanded I adjust my lifestyle for her husband? I've always been someone who values my space. I'm not what you'd call a neat freak or anything. But I like things organized. A certain kind of quiet around me, basically. A vibe that feels calm and uncluttered. My 2-bedroom apartment is my sanctuary. My little piece of the world where I can unwind from the hustle and bustle of work, life, and everything else. I've put so much effort into making it feel just right. You walk in, and there's this minimalist but cozy setup. Not a lot of extra stuff. Just the essentials, everything with its place, and the kind of energy that makes me feel at home the second I open the door. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my family. And I love having people over, but in doses. I guess you could say I've gotten used to being on my own. Setting my own routines, making my own decisions about what I need to feel balanced and grounded. Living alone has a way of making you protective of your peace. You know, I keep my mornings calm, my evenings chill, and, yes, the guest room is all mine for my little hobbies. It's where I paint a little, read, and unwind with my favorite shows. Just a quiet life, and I like it that way. But my sister? She's a little different. She's got more energy, a bit more chaos in her spirit. And, for as long as I can remember, she's always been more comfortable with the messiness of life than I have. She's 2 years older, but we've always had this close bond. Even though our personalities don't line up perfectly, we were the typical siblings, always there for each other despite all the little disagreements. So, naturally, I was thrilled when she told me she was getting married. I mean, seeing her happy and moving into this next phase of life, it's a big deal. You know, and even though we live a few hours apart, I couldn't wait to get closer with her new husband too. So when she asked if she could stay with me for a few weeks, I immediately said yes. It felt like a no-brainer. I imagined it'd be just like old times, spending late nights talking. Maybe watching our favorite movies. Catching up. I mean, yeah, I didn't know her husband that well, but it was a chance to bond with him, too, right? What could go wrong? Just a couple of weeks. It was like everything was perfectly fine, until it wasn't. A couple of days after I said she could stay, my phone buzzed with a message from her, and as soon as I read it, I felt my stomach drop. She'd apparently forgotten to mention a few crucial details. First, her husband would be coming with her, which, okay, I could get used to. But then came the part that really caught me off guard. She started listing all these adjustments she needed me to make to accommodate them both. According to her, I'd have to rearrange my entire apartment to make space for their relationship. And it wasn't just about them needing room for their suitcases or personal things, no. She wanted me to stop using my guest room as my hobby space. I don't know, maybe she thought that was reasonable since it's technically a guest room. But it felt invasive. That's my space to unwind. It's where I've set up everything that helps me relax. Like my paints, books, and other stuff. Now, all of a sudden, I'd have to clear it out, make it neutral, and essentially hand it over to them. But it didn't stop there. She also informed me that her husband works from home and would need quiet hours during the day. Which would be fine, if this was their home. But it's my home, my little place of peace. Apparently, though, my lifestyle was going to have to take a backseat. No playing music during the day. No inviting friends over. And essentially, I'd need to live like a house guest in my own apartment for the next few weeks. It sounded crazy. Like they were planning on taking over my entire space and pushing me into the background. And here's the kicker. She had this tone in her message. Like all these requests were completely reasonable. Even expected. She didn't ask if I was okay with these changes. She just laid them out. Assuming I'd nod along and say, sure, anything for you guys. Reading that message felt like a slap in the face. I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. It was like she'd already decided that my life, my routines, my preferences, none of it mattered now that she had a husband in the picture. I knew marriage could change things. Sure, but I didn't expect it to turn my sister into someone who'd demand I turn my own space upside down to make her husband comfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling of being taken for granted. I mean, yeah, it's my sister, and I'd want to help her if she needed it. But this didn't feel like helping. This felt like I was being asked to hand over my life on a silver platter and smile about it. It wasn't just a few minor adjustments, it was everything I did to make my home feel like mine. My music, my friends, my hobby space, all the things that make me feel happy and grounded would have to be put on pause for who knows how long. Just because my sister's new husband didn't feel comfortable on his own. It was hard to wrap my head around. I'd always considered my apartment my sanctuary, my safe place. It's where I come back to recharge, where I feel truly at ease. And now, here was my sister, essentially telling me that my own needs and comfort weren't important. She didn't even ask if this arrangement would inconvenience me or if I'd be okay with such a drastic change. It was just assumed. After a restless night of tossing and turning, I decided I had to address it directly. I couldn't keep stewing in my own frustration without saying something to her. So, the next morning, I called my sister. I tried to start off calmly, explaining how much I value my space and why having them here, with all these conditions, felt like a huge imposition. I wanted her to understand that it wasn't about her or her husband. Specifically, it was about the lifestyle I'd built for myself and how much that mattered to me. I've worked hard to create a life that's balanced and feels like my own. Having anyone in my space for that long, especially with all these demands, just didn't sit right. I thought maybe, if I explained it that way, she'd see my perspective. But the minute I mentioned feeling uncomfortable with the adjustments she was asking for, her defenses shot up. She didn't try to see where I was coming from. Instead, she jumped straight to guilt-tripping me. She started by saying how they didn't have anyone else to turn to. How they were still settling into married life and just needed a little support from family. I get that. I really do. But then she slipped into talking about how family's supposed to be there for each other no matter what. She asked if I would honestly turn my back on her and her husband when they just needed a temporary place to stay. She even threw in how it would just be a few weeks, and how they'd do the same for me if I ever needed it. But would they, though? Would they really drop everything to cater to me, at the expense of their own comfort? I doubted it, and the thing is, even if they would, it still didn't feel fair for her to ask me to disrupt my life so completely for them. I told her as much. Gently, but it only seemed to make her more upset. She came back with how it was my duty as her sister to support her in this new stage of her life. You don't understand what it's like to be married, she said. It's not just about you anymore. Sometimes you have to compromise to help each other out. That one stung. I felt like she was twisting my single status into something shameful. Like my life was somehow less important or legitimate because I wasn't married. After that call, I thought things might cool down. Maybe, after reflecting, she'd understand I wasn't trying to be selfish. I just didn't want to completely change my lifestyle to accommodate them. But I was wrong. She called back later that evening. And this time, her tone was different, colder. There was no room for compromise. She said that if I didn't agree to let them stay under the conditions they'd set, they wouldn't be visiting at all. She told me this as if it was some kind of final warning. As though I'd regret it if they didn't come. In her mind, I was choosing my selfish lifestyle over family. She even implied that by refusing, I was putting a wedge between us. I felt so taken aback. It was as if our relationship was only as good as my willingness to let them bulldoze over my boundaries. And it hurt. Honestly, I'd always been there for her when she needed me. No questions asked. But now that I was asking for something, just this once, she was drawing a line in the sand. Her exact words were, if you can't open your home to us in our time of need, then maybe we need to rethink what kind of relationship we have as sisters. That struck deep. I felt a mix of anger and sadness. Here was my own sister essentially questioning the strength of our bond because I wasn't willing to transform my home and routine to accommodate her new husband. A guy the first hardly knew. It was as if all the years we'd shared meant nothing if I wasn't ready to bend over backward for her now. I tried to explain myself one last time, but she wasn't listening anymore. She just kept reiterating that they needed a place to stay and that I was letting them down. She didn't want to hear my reasons. Didn't care about the sacrifices I'd already made in creating a peaceful, stable life for myself. To her, I was being obstinate, maybe even petty, and she wasn't going to beg me any further. She made it clear, it was her way, or nothing. By the end of the call, I felt drained, torn between standing my ground and giving in just to avoid the fallout. After that call, I was left staring at my phone, just reeling. The idea that my sister was willing to jeopardize our relationship over this blew my mind. I went from feeling defensive to second-guessing myself. Was I really being that selfish? Was I putting my need for quiet and control over my own sister's happiness? I mean, they were newlyweds, and she's my only sister. I started to spiral, thinking about all the family gatherings that would be filled with tension if I stuck to my decision. But as I kept mulling it over, I realized that it wasn't just about a few quiet hours or a rearranged guest room. This was my home, the place I'd built for myself. My sanctuary. I'd worked hard to have this space, and I'd carefully cultivated it to feel like, well, like me. I didn't even have roommates in college because I knew how much I valued my personal space. Now, my sister was asking me to give that up indefinitely for her and a man who felt like a stranger to me. And not just to give it up but to transform my space and lifestyle to fit her vision of a welcoming home. Then there was the fact that her husband, this guy the first barely knew, was dictating all these changes. Quiet hours, in my own apartment? No music, no friends over, no using my own guest room for my hobbies? It wasn't just inconvenient, it was like they wanted to turn my home into their little bubble. As if I didn't exist. And what really got me was that she didn't seem to understand how much she was asking. Or worse, maybe she did, and just didn't care. I thought back to all the times she'd needed something from me. I'd always been there for her, advice, help with a move, emotional support during her tough times. And yes, I was happy to do all those things because she was my sister. But this felt different. It felt like I was being strong-armed into surrendering my life to fit her new one. As if my comfort and boundaries were negotiable simply because she got married. By the next day, I was emotionally drained but more sure of my decision. I sent her a text. Something simple and to the point. I loved her. And she was always welcome to visit on reasonable terms. But I couldn't completely overhaul my life for her and her husband. I wished her well, said I hoped we could still work something out in the future. It felt like a compromise on my end. Like an olive branch without completely losing myself in the process. She didn't respond for a few days. When she finally did, it was a short, cold message. Understood. After her, understood, text. I thought that was it. She'd move on, find another place to stay. And hopefully, in a few months, we'd laugh about how stubborn we both were. But the silence dragged on. Days turned into a week. Then 2. It was like she'd completely shut me out. Then, my mom called. She'd heard from my sister, who'd clearly painted her own version of events. According to my mom, my sister was devastated, saying I had slammed the door in her face when she needed me the most. Mom said something like, family is all we've got at the end of the day, and that, a few adjustments, wouldn't hurt me. She even suggested that maybe I was just used to living alone for so long that I couldn't understand the importance of compromise. I felt my stomach drop as she kept talking. It wasn't just my sister I was potentially alienating here, it was my entire family. And I could tell from my mom's tone that she thought I was being unreasonable. Selfish even. It was like the weight of family expectations was suddenly pressing down on me, making me feel like I'd done something terribly wrong. But underneath that guilt, there was a tiny voice telling me that I was still in the right. That standing up for my boundaries wasn't selfish, even if my family couldn't see it that way. My dad called next, and his take was a bit more practical. He reminded me that as adults, we're all entitled to make our own decisions about our space and that it was okay to want things on my terms. But even he hinted that family harmony sometimes requires bending. Even if it's uncomfortable. That was my dad for you, always wanting to smooth things over, even if it meant sidestepping the real issue. And of course, my other siblings chimed in with their opinions. My younger brother actually sided with me, saying he'd be furious if someone tried to take over his apartment. But my older sister was firmly on my sister's side, saying I was too rigid and should be happy to accommodate just for a little while. She thought I was putting my introverted quirks above family unity. By this point, I felt like I was standing on an island, isolated, and waving a flag that said, I matter too. But the more everyone weighed in, the more I felt like the odd one out. It was like the very boundaries I was trying to protect were being questioned by everyone I cared about. It left me wondering if maybe, just maybe, they were right, and I was the one being unreasonable. But then, I reminded myself that if I gave in, I'd be the one living with the consequences. I'd be the one feeling like a guest in my own home. I wish I could say that. After talking to everyone, I felt some grand sense of clarity. But really, I just felt drained. It's amazing how family, the people who are supposed to know you best, can also be the ones who make you second-guess everything about yourself. All those years of being the good sister, the dependable one who'd never say no, seemed to hang in the air, pushing me to bend just one more time. But this time, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I thought about how, if I let them stay, it wouldn't just be a few adjustments, like my mom said. I'd be giving up the space that I'd worked so hard to create for myself, the space that represented my independence, my peace, my life on my own terms. I knew that if I compromised now, I'd end up resentful. I'd be living under my own roof with an invisible layer of tension, counting the days until they left and wondering why I hadn't just said no. That evening, I sent one last message to my sister. I kept it simple, saying something like, I understand you're hurt, and I'm sorry it's come to this, but I need to keep my boundaries. This doesn't mean I don't love you or that I won't be there for you when you need me. It just means that, for now, I need my space. She didn't reply right away, but I didn't expect her to. I knew this wouldn't be easy to accept, and maybe it would take time for her to come around. And honestly, I was okay with that. Sometimes, people need time to process boundaries, especially when they're not used to you setting them. Over the next few days, I found myself second-guessing my decision less and less. Every time a wave of guilt hit, I reminded myself of the peace I feel knowing my apartment, my home, was still my sanctuary. I held onto that thought like a lifeline. It's strange how something as simple as refusing a visit can reveal so much about your relationships, about what people expect from you, and about what you're willing to give. I realized that setting boundaries isn't a sign of selfishness, it's a sign of self-respect. And if that meant a few people were upset with me, then maybe that was just a consequence I had to live with. After all, if my family really loved me, they'd eventually see that I wasn't trying to push them away. I was just trying to protect myself. In the days that followed, I kept waiting for the sky to fall, for my phone to blow up with angry calls, for messages telling me how I'd ruined everything. But, to my surprise, it was mostly silence. It was like my sister and the rest of my family were processing it all in their own way, maybe needing the same space I had been craving. And honestly, that silence was a relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. I poured myself into my routine, rediscovering the little things I love about living alone. I woke up each morning, played my music at whatever volume one wanted, made coffee, and spent time in my hobby room, without a second thought. It was funny, knowing that I was allowed to enjoy my space, that no one would come in and ask me to rearrange it or quiet down, brought a calm that I didn't know I needed. I felt grounded, anchored in my life and my choices. The guilt started to fade, replaced by something I hadn't expected, pride. I started looking at my decision not as a rejection of my family, but as an affirmation of myself. I'd always been the one to compromise, to step aside, to make space. It had been so easy to slip into that role, thinking that if I kept doing it, people would appreciate me more, love me more. But the truth was, the more I gave up parts of myself, the more invisible I felt. I was done with that. After about a week, I got a message from my sister. She didn't say much, just a simple, "Hey, I understand now. I'm sorry for pushing." It felt like a weight lifted. I knew she still might not completely agree with my choice, but the fact that she was willing to acknowledge it meant everything to me. It was a reminder that, even though family relationships can be complicated, they don't have to break when we stand up for ourselves. My mom called, too, in a gentler tone this time. She said she didn't realize how much I'd been sacrificing just to keep the peace. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something. It was her way of letting me know that she understood, at least a little, that this decision was about more than just hosting or helping. It was about claiming the respect I'd been quietly longing for. And so, life went on. My sister and her husband found another place to stay, and our relationship settled back into familiar, if slightly redefined, territory. It felt different, better even. I realized that my boundaries didn't push my family away. They actually brought us closer by showing them who I really was and what I valued. In the weeks that followed, things settled in a way that felt more balanced, healthier even. My sister and I were talking again, not about her staying over, not about her husband or any adjustments, just talking. She'd call, sometimes to share funny moments from her day, sometimes to tell me about her latest work project. It was almost like the dust had finally settled and we'd found a new normal. One built on respect. I felt this incredible mix of relief and calm, knowing that our relationship hadn't unraveled, that setting a boundary hadn't torn us apart. My family and I even began to talk more openly about things that we used to sweep under the rug. My mom actually surprised me one day, calling to ask if I felt like I'd been put in too many support roles in the family over the years. It wasn't like her to initiate that kind of conversation, and it was an awkward start, but it turned into one of the most honest talks we'd ever had. I admitted that I often felt responsible for keeping the peace and making people happy. And she admitted that she'd come to rely on me for that without even realizing it. She apologized in her own way. "I guess I never noticed you took on so much," she'd said, and while it wasn't perfect, it was a start. I told her that I loved my family, but I needed a different role, one that didn't leave me feeling drained or invisible. The funny thing was, having this conversation actually made me feel closer to her, and closer to my sister too. For the first time, it felt like I wasn't just there to keep the peace but to be heard and valued. I started looking at my own boundaries in a different way. Setting limits wasn't about shutting people out, it was about making room for my own well-being. It was about being my own person, someone with needs and wants that mattered. That realization became a kind of guiding light, a reminder that my life, my peace, my space, my time, was worth protecting, even from the people I loved. These days, I feel a strength that's hard to put into words. I'm still close to my family, but now it's on terms that respect who I am, not just who they want me to be. I still help when I can, but I don't sacrifice myself in the process. It's empowering, knowing I can have both, a strong sense of self and meaningful connections with my family. I can love them deeply without losing myself. I look back on everything that's happened, on the guilt, the frustration, the endless back and forth, and I feel proud that I stood up for myself, proud that I found a way to honor my own needs, and proud that, in the end, my family came to respect those boundaries too. AITA for uninviting my fiancé's work wife from our wedding. I'm marrying this amazing guy, the love of my life, and after more than a year of planning, it's finally almost here. You'd think I'd be floating, right? But no, because there's this cloud over everything, and that cloud's name is Lily. Let me backtrack a little. My fiancé and Lily go way back. They've worked together for about 5 years now. She's been his work wife from almost the beginning, and he's always spoken fondly of her. Honestly, at first, I was relieved. I thought, great, he has a good friend at work who keeps him grounded. Work can be stressful for him, so it seemed nice that he had someone to share it with. She was like this harmless piece of his life that I didn't pay much mind to. I remember thinking, be the cool fiancé who's supportive and doesn't feel threatened by her guy having female friends. So that's what I did. I didn't make a fuss about their friendship. I wanted to be understanding. I wanted to be secure. The kind of partner who doesn't make issues where there aren't any. For the longest time, it didn't even cross my mind that she could be anything more than his work buddy. But over time, things started to feel a little off. At first, it was small stuff. He'd mention funny things she said or tell me how she totally gets him. You know, the kinds of things people do with friends. But then it started happening a lot more frequently. He was mentioning her name all the time. I'd hear more about her day than mine sometimes. She knew things about his life and work that even I didn't. Which stung. I mean, she's his friend, I get that. But I'm his fiancé. I'm supposed to be the person he turns to, right? It wasn't just the stories and the inside jokes. They'd be texting each other constantly. Even late at night, sometimes, we'd be in bed, winding down, and I'd hear his phone go off. And I'd see that look on his face. That little smile, and I'd know it was her. He'd tell me it was work-related. But at some point, I couldn't keep believing that. There's only so much work people need to discuss at midnight. I tried not to show my discomfort. I wanted to keep that cool fiancé vibe. But inside, it was starting to eat at me. It was like this slow, creeping feeling that I wasn't the one he turned to first. At least not always. Then, it went beyond just their conversations. She'd send him little jokes. And he'd laugh so hard. I know it sounds ridiculous. But watching him light up at her texts started to hurt. Here I was, the person he's building a future with. And it felt like I was sharing him with someone else. And the way he'd laugh or bring up their jokes, it was like she understood some part of him I didn't. Or maybe he let her see parts of himself that he kept hidden from me. I know it's not rational. But I started to feel this weird sense of competition. Like I had to measure up to whatever they had. The thing that really got to me was how he'd defend her whenever I brought up how close they were. If I even hinted at being uncomfortable, he'd brush it off, telling me I was being silly. That she was just a friend. His work wife. He'd say it so casually. Like it was nothing. But to me, it felt like something. I just wanted to know that I was his person. His confidant. The one who mattered most. But every time he laughed off my concerns or said I was taking things too seriously, it chipped away at me a little more. Looking back, I can see that's when the first crack started. I wanted to believe him. I really did. I wanted to trust that this was just a harmless friendship. But with every late-night text and every inside joke, I felt a little bit more like I was on the outside looking in. And here we are, months away from the wedding. And that feeling's only grown. I'm supposed to be marrying him, building a life with him. But some days, it feels like she's already claimed a piece of him. And the worst part? I feel ridiculous. I feel insecure and needy. And that's not who I am. I want to be the supportive fiancé who isn't threatened by her partner's friends. But I can't shake this nagging feeling. This weird sense that there's something more there. Something I'm not a part of. I love him. I know he loves me, too. But there's this part of him that seems reserved for her. And that's hard to accept. I keep wondering if it's all in my head. If I'm just being insecure. But there's only so much you can take before you start questioning things. Right? I mean, how close is too close? And at what point do you stop brushing off your instincts and start paying attention to what they're telling you? You'd think that planning a wedding would be a unifying thing for a couple. You know, all the little choices and compromises. Dreaming together, picking things that represent us. But somehow, this whole process has just felt like I'm competing with Lily, of all people. Isn't that the craziest thing? It started with her suggestions. She had all these opinions. And she wasn't shy about sharing them. Even when I didn't ask. She'd mention, oh, that venue you're looking at? I don't know. It doesn't really feel like him. Does it? Or, you're doing bright flowers? But he's never liked those. Right? At first, I just brushed it off. I mean, I wanted to be polite. I thought she was just trying to help. In her own way. But then it hit me. I'm picking things that make us happy. And suddenly I've got her comments in the back of my mind. Making me second guess every choice. And the dress. Oh my god. The dress. I remember when I was so excited about finally picking it out. I told him all about the appointment. Even showed him some veiled hints on what styles I was considering. And what did he say? Oh, you should take Lily along. She has a good eye for style. He thought he was being helpful. But I just stood there. Stunned. Why on earth would I want her opinion on my wedding dress? Why would she be the person I'd want to bring for something as personal as that? I tried to laugh it off. But I felt this sharp pang of annoyance. I told him, as casually as I could manage. I think I'll go with my mom or a friend. But thanks. He didn't see anything wrong with his suggestion. And I knew better than to argue about it. But deep down, it hurt. This was supposed to be my moment, something between me and him. But it felt like Lily had already put her fingerprints on everything. Then there was the engagement party. Now, that was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of my life. Right? We had our closest family and friends there. Celebrating us. Celebrating our future. But the whole time, she was there, practically glued to his side. She looked lovely, I'll give her that. But it felt like every time I looked up, there she was, cracking jokes, sharing her little stories with him. Almost like she was his date. She was getting more laughs and smiles from him than I was. I felt like a guest at my own engagement party. I kept trying to join their conversation. Wedge myself in there, but every time, she'd steer it back to something I wasn't part of, a work thing. An inside joke, something only they would understand. I remember standing there, drink in hand, smiling through gritted teeth, feeling so out of place. He was right there with me. But he may as well have been miles away. And then came the cherry on top. I was just walking over to them when she said, you know, if you change your mind, you could always marry me instead. I froze. I mean, who says that? And he just laughed it off, brushing it aside like it was the most normal thing in the world. But it wasn't normal, not to me. I felt this pit in my stomach. This horrible feeling that she was taking something from me. And I didn't know if it was real or if I was losing my mind. When I finally pulled him aside and told him how much that comment hurt, he just looked at me like I was being ridiculous. She's just joking around, he said, like I was some overreacting mess who couldn't take a little humor. But how am I supposed to find that funny? How would anyone? She was overstepping, plain and simple, but he couldn't, or wouldn't, see it. To him, I was making mountains out of molehills. And that hurt more than I can even explain. The final straw came at the end of the night. Lily had had a few drinks, and she stumbled up to me with this smirk on her face and asked, "Are you really okay with how close we are?" And then she said something like, "I just can't imagine him with anyone else." I felt like she'd punched me in the gut. There I was, finally celebrating our engagement, and she couldn't resist reminding me, in her own little way, that she's still in his life. Still close. Still his work wife. I didn't say a word back. I couldn't. I just turned and walked away. Later that night, I told him I didn't want her at the wedding. It was supposed to be our day. A day about us. And the thought of having her there, making those little comments, stealing those little moments, just made me sick. I didn't want to be overshadowed by her anymore. I'd had enough. But he didn't take it well. He said I was overreacting. That my jealousy was ruining things. He told me that uninviting her would damage his work reputation. That he'd look bad at the office. He was angry. Really angry. Like I just asked him to cut off a limb or something. He said I was making him choose between his best friend and me. I felt like I'd been slapped. All I wanted was to feel like I mattered most on our wedding day. Was that really asking so much? After that fight, I felt shattered. I'd been building up to this for months. Quietly swallowing all these little hurtful moments. Trying to be the understanding fiancé who didn't make waves. But it just felt like he was completely blind to what I was feeling. I had to wonder, was I really being unreasonable? I mean, I know work wives and work husbands are a thing. But this felt different. This wasn't just a friendship. It was like she was occupying this huge part of his life that I thought was meant for me. The thing that really hit me was when he threw that word out there, jealousy. Like my feelings were nothing more than petty envy. Like I was some insecure partner who couldn't handle my man having a close friend. But it wasn't about jealousy, it was about respect. Respect for our relationship. Respect for the boundaries I thought we both shared. I just wanted him to see that. And then he mentioned his reputation. He said uninviting her would make him look bad at work. Like he had no backbone or like I was some kind of jealous dictator in our relationship. But here's the thing, if this were just about work, if this were truly just a harmless friendship, why did I feel so displaced? Why was I so upset? It was like he cared more about what she and his coworkers thought than he cared about my peace of mind. That hurt more than I can even explain. For days, I went over everything in my head, dissecting every little interaction, every comment she'd made, every time he'd brushed off my feelings. I was spiraling. I started wondering if maybe I was the one with the problem. Was I just insecure? Was I blowing this all out of proportion? But then, I'd remember those things she said at the engagement party. How she'd joked about him marrying her instead. And that comment she made at the end of the night about not imagining him with anyone else. It felt like she was staking a claim on him. Like she wanted me to know that she wasn't going anywhere, and he didn't seem to mind. I felt like I was trapped. I wanted to believe that I was overthinking. That this was just my own insecurity getting the best of me. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore how uncomfortable it all made me feel. Here I was, planning a future with him, but feeling like I was competing with someone who had no right to be competing in the first place. Finally, I went to a couple of close friends for advice. I thought maybe I just needed an outside perspective to help me see things clearly. I laid everything out for them, the texts, the late night calls, her involvement in the wedding planning, the way she'd taken over the engagement party, and those comments she'd made that night. I was bracing myself, honestly, for them to tell me I was crazy or that I was making too big a deal out of it. But instead, they looked at me like they were seeing the whole situation for the first time. 2. They were sympathetic, nodding along, and then one of them said, "It sounds like she's crossing a line." Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just me, they saw it, too. I felt this strange sense of relief. Like I wasn't completely losing it. Like maybe my feelings were valid after all. So, I went back to him. I sat him down and tried, really tried, to explain how much this was hurting me. I told him that I wasn't trying to control his friendships. That I didn't want to come between him and anyone. But that his relationship with Lily was different. I needed him to see that this wasn't just me being insecure or jealous. It was about boundaries, respect, and feeling valued. But he wouldn't budge. He said I was being unfair. That it wasn't right to make him choose between his best friend and his fiancé. I tried to tell him that it wasn't about choosing. That it was about understanding where I was coming from. But it felt like I was talking to a wall. Every time I tried to share how I felt, he'd twist it around, making it seem like I was the one with the problem. Like I was the one creating an issue where there shouldn't be one. And that's when it hit me. If he couldn't understand how important this was to me now. If he couldn't even meet me halfway or see things from my perspective. What did that say about our future? What other things would I be expected to let go of or not take so seriously? It scared me, honestly. I'd always thought of him as someone who valued me, who respected my feelings. But now, it was like I was asking him to see me, really see me, and he just couldn't, or wouldn't. I left that conversation feeling drained, exhausted, and completely defeated. It felt like I was staring at a wall in front of me, blocking any chance of resolution or compromise. And the worst part? That wall was him. After that last conversation, I couldn't shake this feeling of being shut out. It was like I was asking for a place in my own relationship and being told I was asking too much. For days, I tried to brush it off, telling myself that this was just a rough patch, that we'd figure it out. But deep down, I was feeling more and more invisible. Like my feelings were slipping away into some bottomless well every time I tried to make him understand. The more I sat with that, the angrier I got. And then Lily showed up at our place. I was home, going through some of the final wedding details, things like seating arrangements and flower choices. The stuff you do because you're excited to share it with the person you love. He hadn't even mentioned she was coming over, so it caught me off guard. There she was, just waltzing into my space like she belonged there, making herself comfortable while I stood there, dumbfounded. I kept it together at first, sitting on the couch with a polite smile, listening to them go on about work stuff, like I wasn't even in the room. But when she casually leaned over, opened her phone, and started showing him ideas for a surprise gift she wanted to give him at our wedding, I lost it. The nerve she had to insert herself into one of the most personal, private days of my life without a second thought. It was like she was mocking me. I tried to keep calm, but I couldn't stop myself from asking, why does everything have to be about you too? My voice cracked a little as I said it, and it felt like the air in the room shifted. She looked at me with this surprised, almost smug expression, like she'd been waiting for this moment. Oh, don't worry, it's just a little something from me to him. No big deal, no big deal. Those words felt like a slap in the face. Here she was, practically acting like she was part of the wedding, acting like she had some claim over him that even I didn't get to touch. And he just sat there, watching this all go down, like he was completely oblivious to how this looked, how it felt. I turned to him, hoping he'd see the hurt in my eyes, hoping he'd stand up for me. But he just shrugged. It's just a gift, he said, almost dismissively, like I was making a mountain out of a molehill. It was like a switch flipped inside me. I felt this rush of anger, frustration, and betrayal, all wrapped into one. Here I was, his fiancé, the woman he claimed to want to spend his life with. And he couldn't even see how completely disrespectful this whole situation was. I looked back at Lily, who was now smirking like she'd won some twisted game I didn't even know I was playing. I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit there, watching this play out like some sad joke at my expense. I stood up, looked him straight in the eye, and said, if you can't see how hurtful this is, maybe you don't understand what it means to be in a relationship with me. His face fell for a second, like he finally saw the depth of what I was feeling. But then Lily laughed, breaking the moment, pulling his attention right back to her. He glanced at her, then at me, like he was stuck between two worlds. But I could see he wasn't willing to choose. Not really. I left the room before he could say another word, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and heartbreak. It was clear to me, maybe for the first time, that he was never going to stand up to her, that he was never going to draw a line between his relationship with me and whatever bond he had with her. And if he couldn't see how wrong that was, if he couldn't understand how deeply that hurt, then what was I even doing? I shut myself in the bedroom, sitting there alone in silence, feeling the weight of the decision I knew I'd have to make. Sitting alone in that bedroom, I felt like I was finally facing the truth. I didn't want to admit it, but here it was, staring me down. My fiancé couldn't see how much he was hurting me. Or worse, maybe he did see, and he just didn't care enough to do anything about it. For the first time, I started wondering if this was the kind of partnership I could live with, forever. I tried to picture it. The two of us building a life together with Lily always in the background. Acting like she had a stake in him. In us. And honestly, the thought made me sick. It's like, how could I be planning a life with someone who made me feel like I had to compete for his attention? His loyalty? I loved him, but I also loved myself. And I was reaching the end of my rope with all this. I sat there, replaying the past few weeks in my mind, the engagement party. The subtle digs, the way he brushed off my feelings like they were inconveniences. I thought about how he looked when she was around. How quickly he'd light up. How he'd fall into their little world so easily. With me left on the sidelines, wondering if I even mattered. The hurt turned into something sharper. Something that felt a lot like anger. I'd given him so many chances to recognize what was wrong here. To listen to me, to put me first. But every time, he'd chosen her comfort over my peace of mind. And here I was, letting it happen, letting him treat me like a guest in my own relationship. I made up my mind. I was done with feeling like this. I was done with waiting for him to see my side, to step up and be the man I thought I was marrying. He needed to understand what this was doing to us, what he was risking by holding onto this so-called friendship with such a tight grip. And if he couldn't see that, maybe we weren't meant to do this after all. I walked out of the bedroom to find him in the kitchen, scrolling on his phone. He looked up, and his expression softened a bit. Probably thinking we were done with all the tension from earlier. But I had other plans. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding. He nodded, putting his phone down, but he didn't look worried. That was part of the problem. He didn't even think there was an issue. I took a breath, collecting my thoughts one last time. And then I laid it all out. I can't marry you if Lily's going to be part of our lives like this. I said, finally saying the words that had been lodged in my chest for weeks. I'm not asking you to cut her off or to stop being her friend. But I need boundaries. I need you to stop putting her feelings above mine. And I need to feel like I'm the person you're choosing to build your life with. Not her. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something like understanding. But then he shook his head. that familiar look of defensiveness creeping in. You're overthinking this, he said. Lily is just a friend. She's always been a part of my life. And I can't just push her away because you're feeling insecure. There it was again, making it about my supposed insecurity instead of his own unwillingness to see my side. I felt a flash of frustration, but I pushed it down, staying calm. I'm not insecure, I told him. I'm just not okay with being treated like a second choice. This is supposed to be our wedding, our future, and she's acting like she has some special claim to you that I don't even have. And the fact that you don't see that, it's making me question everything. He stared at me, and I could see he was struggling to process what I was saying. But I also saw something else, a kind of stubbornness. This refusal to admit that maybe he'd crossed a line. You're asking me to choose between my best friend and my fiancé, he said, like that was the worst thing anyone could ask of him. No, I said, my voice firmer now. I'm asking you to choose between keeping a boundary-less friendship and respecting the relationship we're building. And if that feels like an impossible choice, then maybe you've already made it. We stood there in silence, and I could feel the weight of my words settle in the air between us. He opened his mouth, then closed it, like he didn't know what to say. I waited, hoping he'd give me some kind of reassurance, some sign that he'd finally understood what I was asking for. But instead, he just sighed, like this was all a big inconvenience for him. I don't know what you want from me, he said finally. This whole thing is just blown out of proportion. That was it. I'd given him every chance to understand, to listen, to show me that he cared about my feelings. And he still couldn't. I felt this wave of disappointment wash over me, stronger than the hurt, stronger than the anger. It was like I was looking at a stranger, someone who didn't have it in him to put us first, to make me feel like I was the most important person in his life. Without another word, I turned and walked back to the bedroom. I shut the bedroom door behind me, and suddenly it was quiet, too quiet. I could still hear him out there, pacing or shuffling around, but it felt like he was miles away. I'd never felt this kind of distance between us before, and it hurt, but at the same time, something clicked. I realized I'd reached my limit. I was done bending, done explaining, done waiting for him to come around. I felt this strange sense of clarity settle over me, like I could finally see everything for what it was. He kept saying I was overreacting, that I was insecure, but honestly, it wasn't insecurity, it was self-respect. There's a difference, and it hit me right then that if he couldn't see it, I wasn't going to keep fighting him on it. I'd been so busy trying to keep him close that I hadn't noticed how hard I'd been holding onto something that wasn't even giving me the security I needed. And the fact that he didn't seem willing to change, didn't even want to try to meet me halfway, told me all I needed to know. I sat down on the edge of the bed and just let it all sink in. All those little moments of feeling overlooked, pushed aside, even belittled, they were no longer just random moments that I could brush off. They were patterns that told me he valued something else, someone else, above my peace, my happiness, and the future we were supposed to be building together. He'd made me feel like I was asking for too much just by wanting a basic level of respect in our relationship. And I finally realized I couldn't keep doing that to myself. I thought about the life I wanted, the kind of partnership I'd always dreamed of. I'd always pictured being with someone who made me feel safe and cherished. Someone who didn't make me feel like I was competing for their attention or commitment. That was the kind of love I deserved, the kind of love I was willing to give. And here I was, wasting that love on someone who couldn't even see why this was hurting me. The hurt was still there. Don't get me wrong, it didn't just go away. But there was something else with it now, a resolve. I'd been bending backward to make things work, to explain, to justify, and to hope he'd understand. But it hit me that maybe I was trying to make something work that just wasn't meant to. Maybe I was with someone who didn't have the same idea of love and partnership that I did. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I wasn't sad. Well, maybe a little, but mostly, I was disappointed and a little angry. Not just at him, but at myself, for letting it get this far, for ignoring those red flags that had been popping up all along. This wasn't how I wanted to feel in a relationship, and it definitely wasn't how I wanted to feel heading into a marriage. It was like I could finally see the full picture of what my life would look like if I stayed with someone who couldn't put me first. A life of feeling like I wasn't quite enough, like I was always competing with someone else for his loyalty, his affection, and honestly, I didn't want that life. I deserved better, and deep down, I think he knew that too. In that quiet moment, sitting on the edge of the bed, I decided something. If he wasn't willing to be the partner I needed, then I was going to choose myself. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling strangely calm. I'd hardly slept, but it didn't matter. I'd made up my mind, and that decision gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew I had to talk to him, and I knew this wasn't going to be easy, but I'd already walked through every possible outcome in my mind, and I was prepared for any of them. I was ready to accept whatever came next. He was already up, standing in the kitchen with his coffee, looking like he hadn't slept much either. He saw me walk in, and for a second, I thought I saw a hint of regret in his eyes. Or maybe it was just exhaustion. Whatever it was, I wasn't going to let it sway me. I couldn't let a flicker of emotion hold me back now. I poured myself a cup of coffee, took a breath, and just started talking. I told him everything. I told him how I felt, how I'd been feeling for months, how the whole work wife situation had chipped away at my trust. my self-worth, my belief that he actually saw a future with me the way I saw one with him. I laid it all out. Each piece, without holding back. I told him that the comment Lily made at the engagement party, the one where she joked about marrying him instead, had cut deeper than he seemed to understand. That every time he dismissed my feelings as jealousy, it chipped away at me a little more. I told him how much it hurt to see him put her feelings, her comfort, her place in his life above mine. And that maybe, if he couldn't understand why that was wrong, we shouldn't be doing this at all. He just stood there, silent, his face a mix of frustration and, maybe, confusion. He tried to defend himself, saying it wasn't fair that I was making him choose between his friendships and our relationship. He kept insisting that I was reading too much into things, that he never meant to make me feel this way. But he didn't apologize, not once. He didn't tell me he was sorry for any of it. He didn't even say he would change or try to make things better. Instead, he doubled down. He told me Lily was his best friend and that he needed her in his life. He said that if I truly loved him, I would trust him and understand that. And then he told me that if I couldn't handle it, maybe I was the one who wasn't ready for marriage. That hit me like a slap to the face. Not because he said it, but because I realized in that moment that he actually believed it. He genuinely thought I was the one who had to change, to make room, to accommodate. He thought I was the problem, that my standards and my needs were too much, too restrictive. He was so entrenched in his own perspective that he couldn't see how much he was hurting me. Or maybe he could see, and he just didn't care enough to do anything about it. I felt a strange calm settle over me as he spoke, like I was watching the end of a story I'd already read. I knew what I had to do, and it hurt like hell, but it also felt right. I looked him in the eye and told him I couldn't marry someone who didn't put me first. I couldn't marry someone who made me feel small, insecure, like I was just one option among others. I told him I loved him, that I'd wanted a life with him, but I loved myself too, and I wasn't going to spend my life fighting for space in my own relationship. He looked stunned, like he couldn't believe I was actually saying it. Maybe he thought I'd back down, that I'd just accept things as they were because I loved him. But I was done with that. I was done waiting for him to come around, to realize what he had with me. I picked up my keys, took one last look around the place we'd planned to share, and I walked out. I left him standing there, coffee cup in hand, watching me go, and as much as it hurt, as much as every step felt like it was tearing me apart, I knew it was the right choice. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I was choosing myself, and that was worth everything. I wish I could say I walked away and everything magically fell into place. That I moved on, found peace, started a new chapter without looking back. But life doesn't work like that, does it? Heartbreak, betrayal, whatever you want to call it, it sticks. It settles in, makes itself at home, and sometimes it feels like it'll never leave. In the days following that last conversation, I kept waiting for him to call, to text, to say something, anything. Part of me, some small, hurt part, wanted him to fight for us, to realize he'd made a mistake and tell me he'd do whatever it took to fix things. But the call never came. And honestly, that silence, that absence, it said everything. In that silence, I learned something important. It wasn't about him or even about Lily anymore. It was about me, what I wanted, what I needed, what I deserved. I'd spent so much time wondering if I was being unreasonable, if my standards were too high, if I was asking for too much. But in that quiet, painful emptiness, I realized I hadn't asked for nearly enough. I leaned on my friends, more than I ever had. They came through in ways I'll never forget, sitting with me late at night, listening to me go over every detail for the 100th time, reassuring me that I hadn't imagined things, that my feelings were valid, that I deserved better. They reminded me of who I was before all this, a person who loved fiercely, who had dreams, who knew her worth. And slowly, piece by piece, I started to rebuild. I began filling my days with things I'd let slide in the chaos of the last few years. I picked up my old hobbies, threw myself into work, even started taking long walks just to clear my head. I found joy in small things, quiet mornings with my coffee, evenings spent reading or watching shows I hadn't made time for in ages. I found parts of myself I'd forgotten, the parts that hadn't been tangled up in him or anyone else. Then there was the wedding. Or rather, what was supposed to be the wedding. The date hung over me like a shadow, this marker of what should have been. I considered running away for a while, maybe taking a trip or hiding out somewhere. But when the day finally came, I decided to do something different. I threw a party. It was spur of the moment. Just a few friends, some food, and way too much wine. We toasted to new beginnings, to choosing ourselves, to breaking free of anything that made us feel less than we were. I laughed harder that night than I had in months, maybe years. For the first time, I felt the weight lift a little. I felt like I was starting to come back to life. Looking back, I know I'll always carry some of that hurt. The memories, the questions, the things I'll never fully understand, they're part of me now. But they're not all of me. They don't define me. They're just one chapter in a story that's still being written. So here I am, moving forward. I don't know what's next. And that's okay. I'm learning to be at peace with that. To trust that I'm strong enough to face whatever comes my way. I'm learning to love myself in ways I'd forgotten. To be my own person. To live my own life. And maybe someday, I'll find someone who sees me for exactly who I am. Who makes me feel like I'm enough? Just as I am. But until then, I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I'm free. In the days, then weeks, and now months that have passed since all of this, I've discovered a version of myself I didn't even know existed. It wasn't immediate, of course. For a long while, it felt like I was wandering through my own life, moving from one day to the next, trying to fill in the empty spaces he'd left behind. The thing is, when you give so much of yourself to someone else, it's hard to figure out what's left when they're gone. But that's what I started to work on, figuring out what was left of me. And maybe, just maybe, adding some new pieces to the mix. One of the first things I did was take time to get away. I booked a weekend up in the mountains. Just a cabin and me in a backpack filled with snacks and books I'd been meaning to read for years. I had no real agenda other than to unplug from everything and just exist. I guess I wanted to escape the noise, the questions from family and friends, the relentless reminders of what had happened and who I'd lost. That weekend, alone in the mountains, gave me something I hadn't had in what felt like forever: space. The kind of silence where you can actually hear yourself think and feel whatever you've been pushing down. And in those still moments, I finally let myself feel everything without trying to shove it away. That's when I started to realize that a big part of what was hurting wasn't just the loss of him or the life we'd planned, but the trust I'd lost in myself. I started doubting my own ability to see things clearly, to know what was real and what wasn't. I had convinced myself, at some level, that I had let this happen, that I'd missed some crucial sign or misjudged everything. But over time, with a lot of reflection, I understood something I should have seen all along. My gut was always right. My discomfort with Lily, the sense of being sidelined, it wasn't insecurity, it was intuition. I had just spent so much time trying to brush it off, rationalize it, or convince myself it was normal to feel this way. It wasn't, and that wasn't my fault. With that realization, something shifted. I gave myself permission to trust myself again, to listen to my own voice over anyone else's. I think we're all told at some point to doubt ourselves, to prioritize being understanding, to bend so we don't seem too demanding or sensitive. But sometimes bending too much just breaks you. So I started practicing little acts of trusting myself, making decisions based solely on what felt right to me without needing to explain it or second guess it. Of course, rebuilding trust in others? That's going to be a whole different journey. Friends have already tried setting me up with people, but I'm not there yet. Honestly, the thought of dating makes my stomach twist in knots. Right now, I don't want to risk handing over my heart when I'm still figuring out how to piece it back together. For the first time, though, that doesn't feel like loneliness. It feels like freedom, like I finally get to build a life that's centered around me and my choices, not compromised for someone else's comfort. I won't lie, there are still moments when I feel that familiar pang of bitterness. Like when I catch sight of a couple holding hands on the street or when a certain song plays that reminds me of him. Sometimes I'll think of the future we'd planned and feel that ache of all the what could have been moments slipping through my fingers. But the ache fades faster now. It doesn't feel as all-consuming. I remind myself that I'm moving forward, not out of spite or anger, but because I owe it to myself to be happy, to live a life where I'm not settling for less than I deserve. My family, my friends, they've been a godsend. They remind me every day of what real support looks like, what genuine love and respect feel like. They're patient with my ups and downs, the days when I'm hopeful and the days when I'm hurting. And maybe most importantly, they've helped me remember that I'm still lovable, still worthy, still me, even after everything. I don't know what the future holds, and I'm slowly coming to terms with the uncertainty. For the longest time, my life was on a set path with him, mapped out and clear. Now, it's more like an open road, with no signs, no set destination, just the promise of whatever comes next. And I think, after everything, that's exactly what I need. A chance to start over on my own terms, to take life one day at a time, and to trust that I'm enough, with or without anyone by my side. And if nothing else, I've learned one invaluable thing. I'll never compromise my worth again. I'll never ignore that little voice inside telling me something's wrong, or bend myself to fit someone else's version of who I should be. From here on out, I'm standing firm in my own story, proud of the journey, and ready for whatever comes next. As time has gone by, I'm seeing my life take a shape I hadn't planned, but one that's starting to feel right. It's funny, really, there's this sense of clarity when you've hit rock bottom and start climbing your way back up. You begin to notice the things that were there all along, the parts of life you might have ignored or undervalued because you were so wrapped up in the idea of us. Now, it's just me, and I'm beginning to find a lot of strength in that. I started leaning into my own interests, those little passions that had always been on the back burner while I was wrapped up in our shared life and his needs. It's simple things, really, learning to paint, going on hikes by myself, even cooking elaborate recipes for no reason other than because I feel like it. Each of these things, as small as they are, remind me that I'm my own person, with interests and goals that don't need to be compromised or put on hold. I don't have to check in with anyone or wonder if they'll like what I'm making for dinner. I don't have to negotiate my plans or account for someone else's preferences. In a way, I feel like I'm meeting myself for the first time. It's strange, but I'm learning that I'm a lot more resilient and adaptable than I'd ever given myself credit for. And yes, there are still moments of weakness. Days when I feel that familiar pang of sadness, that wish that things had turned out differently. But I don't let it define my days anymore. Those feelings come, and I let them, but then I let them go. I also made a big decision, one I might never have had the courage to make if I were still with him. I'm moving to a new city. It's something I'd always talked about but never followed through on, partly because I worried about how it would fit into our life together. Now, though, it's just me, and I'm ready for a fresh start. A new city feels like the perfect way to put a real, tangible distance between myself and the life I'm leaving behind. I've already found an apartment. A cozy little place in a neighborhood that feels vibrant and alive. I love that nobody there knows me. That I'm free to be whoever I want to be without anyone having expectations. I get to build a life for myself from the ground up. Choosing the kind of people I let into my world and the kind of experiences I pursue. It's both terrifying and exhilarating. Packing up and leaving the place I'd called home for years, the place where I'd built so many memories with him, was tougher than I expected. As I sorted through old photos, souvenirs, and notes we'd written to each other, I found myself in this weird place of gratitude and grief. Grateful for the good moments, for the parts of our relationship that taught me love and companionship, but grieving the loss of what I thought would be a forever thing. I saved a few mementos, not because I'm holding on, but because they're part of my story. They're reminders of who I was and how far I've come. When I finally moved, something shifted. I can't even explain it, but as I walked through the doors of my new apartment, I felt this wave of relief, like I was leaving all the heaviness behind. My first night there, I sat on the floor with a cheap bottle of wine and some takeout, just soaking it all in. No furniture yet, no real sense of home, but it felt right. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I've started setting small goals for myself. Nothing too ambitious yet, just little things to keep me moving forward. Joining a local art class, exploring new hiking trails, getting to know my neighborhood. Each day feels like a tiny victory, a step away from the past and toward this new life I'm building. It's hard to explain, but I feel lighter, like I've shed a version of myself that was holding me back. And sure, there are still doubts that creep in. Moments where I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm making a mistake leaving it all behind. But those doubts don't last. Because every time I question myself, I remember what I've learned, that I'm worth it, that I deserve a life where I don't have to shrink myself or ignore my needs. I'm learning to trust myself again, one small step at a time. I don't know where this journey will lead, and honestly, I'm okay with that. For the first time, I'm not in a rush to figure it all out. I'm letting life unfold, finding comfort in the unknown, and letting myself be curious about the future. So here I am, on the other side of it all. It feels strange, closing one chapter so completely and stepping into a new one with no real blueprint. I'm learning that not having all the answers is okay, that just because I don't know what's coming next doesn't mean I'm not on the right path. I'm finally finding a sense of peace in the unknown, and it's honestly liberating. In my new city, I'm becoming someone I don't quite recognize yet, but in the best way. I'm more open, more willing to step out of my comfort zone. I go out to new places by myself, strike up conversations with strangers, say yes to things I might have turned down before. It's almost like every yes I say is a way of telling myself, you're capable, you're strong, and the more I step out, the more I find pieces of myself I didn't know were there. One of the first things I did was sign up for a pottery class. I don't know what drew me to it. Maybe the idea of creating something tangible, something I could see and touch, something that was wholly mine. At first, I was terrible at it, clumsy, unsure, but over time, I've gotten better, and I find a sense of calm in the process. Shaping clay, making mistakes, fixing them, and turning it into something beautiful. It's like a metaphor for my life right now. I'm shaping this new existence for myself, making mistakes along the way, but turning it into something I can be proud of. I'm also finding ways to build a support system here. New friends, new routines. I'm learning that friendships can be just as powerful and fulfilling as any romantic relationship. The people I've met here have been such a breath of fresh air, people who don't know my past, who don't see me as part of a we or us, but just as me. It's freeing to be known without any preconceived notions, without any of the baggage that came with my old life. And you know what? I'm finding that I'm actually really good on my own. I used to think that being single, being alone, meant being lonely, but it's the opposite. I'm learning to enjoy my own company, to listen to my own needs, to respect my own boundaries. There's a lot of beauty in waking up in a space that's mine alone, where I make all the decisions, where I call all the shots. I've stopped checking up on what he's doing. At first, it was hard. I'd wonder how he was, if he was missing me, if he regretted anything. But over time, I realized that none of that mattered. What he's doing, who he's with, whether he's thinking about me or not, it's not my business anymore. That part of my life is over, and it's not my responsibility to hold on to any of it. Letting go isn't easy, but it's like setting down a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying for so long. It feels like freedom. I don't know if I'll ever forgive him completely. Maybe someday, I will, but for now, I've forgiven myself for the mistakes I made, for the love I gave that maybe wasn't reciprocated, for the trust I placed in someone who didn't deserve it. I don't regret the relationship because it taught me what I deserve. But I'm not carrying its shadows anymore. I look at where I am now, and I feel proud. I'm proud that I took a stand for myself, Proud that I chose to prioritize my own well-being over staying in something that hurt me. It's not easy to walk away, to let go of all the dreams you had for a future with someone. But I did it, and I'm stronger for it. And now, I get to dream new dreams. Ones that don't rely on someone else's presence or approval. I get to build a future that's entirely mine, with possibilities that are wide open. I don't know where I'll be in 5 years, or even in 1, but I know that wherever I am, I'll be okay because I'll be there for myself. Life is unpredictable, and I'm finally learning to embrace that. I'm learning to embrace myself, the whole, complicated, beautiful mess that I am. And for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful, excited even. I'm not afraid of what comes next. Because I know that whatever happens, I've got my own back. And that's more than enough.